Hey you guys, and welcome to La Verdad con Josie, or The Truth with Josie. Since my channel is in Spanish, but I'm gonna try to translate all the videos. It's just that it's a little tough. So let's take a look at the history of influenza. Since ancient times, influenza has been known as capricious, an unpredictable disease that once came from an animal that came from nowhere, terrorized entire populations at the same time without prior notice and without schedule, and disappeared as suddenly as it had so mysteriously arrived, never to be seen again for years or decades. It behaved differently from any other disease. It was thought not to be contagious, and it got its name because it was said that its comings and goings were governed by the influence of the stars. So the name at first was influenza or influenza. But in 1880, influenza was domesticated. From that year on, it will always be present in all corners of the world. It will mysteriously disappear as before, but it could be counted on that it will return at more or less the same time the following year. And it has never been absent since. Like anxiety disorder, influenza is so common and seemingly so familiar that a complete review of its history is needed to unmask this stranger and convey the enormity of the public health disaster that have occurred for more than 140 years ago. It is not that we don't know enough about the flu virus, we know more than enough. The microscopic virus associated with this disease has been studied so extensively that scientists know more about its tiny life cycle than any other microorganism. But this has been a reason to ignore many unusual facts about the disease, including the fact that it's not contagious. In 2001, Canadian astronomer Ken Tapping, along with two other doctors from British Columbia, were the last scientists to confirm once again that for at least the last 3 centuries, influenza pandemics have been more likely to occur during the solar magnetic activity peaks at the height of each 11-year solar cycle. In 1992, one of the world authorities on influenza epidemiology, R. Edgar Hope Simpson, published a book in which he reviewed the essential facts and pointed out that they did not rely on a mode of transmission by direct human-to-human contact. During the epidemic of 1932 and 1933, the same time the virus was isolated during its 71-year career, many questions of hope were never answered, such as why is influenza seasonal? Why is influenza almost completely absent except during the few weeks of an epidemic month? Why are flu epidemics ending? Why does the epidemic not spread out of season? How can epidemics break out in entire countries and once disappear so miraculously, as if they were suddenly banned? He couldn't imagine how a virus could behave like this. Why does the flu so often target young adults and avoid infants and the elderly? How is it possible that combustion epidemics travel at the same blinding speed in centuries past as they do today? How does the virus pull off its so-called vanishing trick? Hope Simpson listed 21 separate facts about the flu that puzzle him and that seem to defy explanation, assuming it was spread by direct contact. In 1931, Richard Shope, the researcher who isolated the first influenza virus in pigs, also did not believe that the explosive nature of many outbreaks could be explained by direct contact. Shope and later Hope Simpson proposed that influenza is not transmitted from one person to another or from one pig to another. in the normal way, but remains latent in human or pigs carriers, which are scattered throughout large quantities throughout their communities until the virus is reactivated by an environmental trigger of some kind. Hobson further proposed that the trigger is connected to seasonal variations in solar radiation and that it may be the electromagnetic in nature, as many of its predecessors had suggested over the previous 2 centuries. Others who have linked influenza to sunspots or atmospheric electricity have observed the same thing that Heinrich Schewich observed, that every physiological process produces electricity, and he proposed that an electrical disturbance in the atmosphere can prevent the body from discharging it. He reiterated that the common belief that the accumulation of electricity within the body causes symptoms of influenza, and no one has refuted this yet. In 1728, influenza arrived in waves over the Earth's surface, the first influenza pandemic in nearly 150 years. More universal and enduring than any in previously recorded history. That epidemic appeared on every continent, became over vile in 1732, and according to some reports, lasted until 1738, the peak of the next solar cycle. There was a madness among the dogs. The horses were caught with the cold before humanity. Some people, before humanity. Some people had a fever for 6 continuous days, and others who were not sick at all died suddenly. 2 million people around the world died in that pandemic. If influenza is primarily an electrical illness, a response to an electrical disturbance in the atmosphere, then it is not contagious in the ordinary sense. Patterns of epidemics must and do prove this. The deadly pandemic of 1889 began in widely scattered parts of the world. Severe outbreaks were reported everywhere. But the problem is that the disease will still have to travel faster than the trains and ships of the time. Influenza struck explosively and unpredictably, again and again in waves until early 1894. It was as if something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere, as if an unknown vandal had ignited random butcher's fires all over the world. The speed at which influenza travels and its random and simultaneous pattern of spread has perplexed scientists for centuries and has been the most compelling reason for some to suspect that atmospheric electricity is the cause, despite the unknown presence of a widely studied virus. Way before, the influenza was rather neurological and not respiratory. Instead, people had dizziness, insomnia, indigestion, constipation, vomiting, diarrhea, uterine prostate of mental and bodily strength, neuralgia, delirium, coma, and seizures. And upon recovery, many were left with neurasthenia, or even paralysis or epilepsy. Anton Smith published an article titled Madness After the Flu. Yeah, madness after the flu. That's crazy, huh? And concluded that influenza was primarily an epidemic nervous disease. Insane asylums full of patients who have had influenza. These people were suffering from deep depression, mania, paranoia, or hallucinations of various forms. The frequent lack of respiratory diseases was also seen in the 1918 pandemic, even deadly. In his 1978 textbook, Beveridge, who had lived through it, wrote that half of all influenza patients in that pandemic did not have initial symptoms of nasal discharge, sneezing, or treatment pain. They were not like what we know today as cold symptoms. This means that among pandemics, influenza should primarily attack young children, but influenza continues to stubbornly attack adults. The average rate is always between 30 and 40, whether during a pandemic or not. During the 18 pandemic, also monkeys and baboons died in great numbers in South Africa and Madagascar. Sheep in northwest England, horses in France, moose in northern Canada, and buffaloes in Yellowstone. There's no mystery here. We do not get the flu from animals, nor them from us. If influenza is caused by abnormal electromagnetic conditions in the atmosphere, then it affects all living things at the same time, including living things that do not share the same viruses or live closely with each other. Influenza is a virus and also a clinical disease, but the confusion arises because in 1933, human influenza was defined by the organism that it was discovered in that year, and not by clinical symptoms. If an epidemic occurs and you get the same illness as everyone else, but you cannot isolate an influenza virus from your tube and you do not develop antibodies against one, then you are said to not have influenza. But the fact is, although influenza viruses are somehow associated with disease epidemics, they have never been shown to cause them. Another indication that something is very, very wrong with prevailing theories is the failure of vaccination programs. Although vaccines have been shown to confer some immunity to certain strains of the flu virus, several leading virologists have admitted over the years that vaccines have done nothing to stop epidemics and that the disease still behaves as it does over 1,000 years ago. In fact, after reviewing 259 vaccination studies from the British Medical Journal spanning 40 years, 40-year-old Tom Jefferson recently concluded that flu vaccines have no impact on any real outcomes, such as school absences, missed work days, and illness and disease. Influenza-related death. The shameful secret among virologists is that since 1933 to the present day, listen to these, my people, there have been no experimental studies proving that influenza, either virus or disease, is always transmitted from person to person by normal. So, ladies and gentlemen, we came to the conclusion where we saw that many scientific studies have been done where it is proven that viruses are not contagious person to person, or animal to animal, or animal to person. That it's all have been a lie, especially Corona and COVID, and that we cannot continue to deceive ourselves. There's so many studies like I've shown here, and I'm gonna link. I'm gonna leave the link below where you guys can read the book The Invisible Rainbow, where I'm getting all this information, and it's fantastic, where there's so many proof about influenza not causing a virus, or that it's not caused by a virus, and all that stuff. I'm also going to be making a video about 5G, on how it's affecting us and how it will affect us. And you'll see how everything makes sense about electromagnetic waves and others. Yeah, and among other things that are happening. So thank you for joining me here in The Truth with Josie, or La Verdad con Josie. I will see you next time. God bless you, and goodbye.